The Tunnel by Raymond Harvey. George Wiggs was just about to light his second cigarette when the small bell on the far wall of his signal box shattered the silence. Although he had been a signalman now for over 8 years, the sudden pinging of the warning bell still made him jump. Automatically, he fished out his pocket watch and glanced at the hands. The 12:18's early tonight, he thought to himself as he replaced his watch. Still, the goods trains usually were early or on time. It was always the passenger trains that were late, and which made his job more difficult. He pushed himself up from the old armchair and, taking up his large white duster, made his way over to the neat row of brass handles. Selecting the appropriate lever, he wrapped his duster around the handle and with an experienced tug shifted the lever into the required position. This done, he pressed the bell button to warn the next signal box, then after writing the time in the logbook, returned to his armchair. Now for a quiet half hour, he thought to himself, knowing that the next train was not due until 12:45. George settled down in the armchair and picked up the unlighted cigarette from the ashtray. Soon the blue tobacco smoke was curling into the air, which was already laden with the smell of burning paraffin from the 2 bright lamps in the signal box. Comfortable and content, George selected one of the colourful magazines from his pile on the floor. One of his first jobs when he came on duty was to unlock his cupboard and take out his pile of bright magazines. George was very proud of his collection, for all the magazines contained pin-up photographs of girls. George had soon realised that his job required a great deal of killing time in between trains, and had found that studying colour pictures of naked females was a great help. Yet, as George gazed longingly at the picture of a large-breasted blonde girl emerging from the sea, he couldn't help comparing her with Veronica, his wife. Veronica may not be as well proportioned as this nymph of the sea, but she was just as pretty, and her hair was just as blonde. But this nymph of the sea was smiling at him. Veronica didn't smile at him. This worried George. He realised that he and his wife had been steadily drifting apart in the last few years. He still loved Veronica deeply, but never seemed to get an opportunity of showing her. There was so much night shift to do in his job, and when he got home in the morning, tired and ready for bed, Veronica would be getting up and starting her day. The only time he ever saw her really was from 4 o'clock to about 9 o'clock in the evening, when she always seemed to be busy doing some job or other, and much too busy to spend time with George. On a few occasions he had put his arms around her while she was doing something around the house, only to be brushed away with a, "Oh, George, how do you expect me to do my work with you getting in the way?" Or, "George, will you stop it and grow up?" Now he didn't try any more, but contented himself with his pile of lovely girls, who always smiled at him and never told him to get out of the way or grow up. Suddenly George jumped again. This time it was not the warning bell, but the jangling of his telephone bell that broke the silence. He closed his magazine and replaced it carefully on the pile. Now what was the matter, he wondered, as he picked up the receiver. "Hello, this is George Wiggs, box 172 speaking." "Hello, George, Harry here." The voice of the chief controller crackled in his ear. "Just ringing to tell you we've had a derailment. It's one hell of a mess. Goods, not passenger, so no injuries, thank goodness." "Oh dear," broke in George. "How did it—" "Sorry, George, no time for details, too much to be done. Just letting you know you can stand down for tonight. I hope we'll be all clear by tomorrow. Good night." There was a sharp click and the line was dead. George replaced the receiver slowly. Well, a stand down. He took out his watch and saw it was only 12:35. If he got off as soon as possible, he could be home before 1 o'clock. He gathered up his pile of magazines and locked them away. Then, putting on his coat, he turned out the 2 oil lamps, locked the signal box door, and clip-clopped down the wooden steps. The countryside was bathed in the pale white light of the full moon as he started his way home along the railway track. As the line would not be used that night, he could take the shortcut through Dingle Tunnel. He strode briskly down the track, walking on the sleepers between the rails, until at last he came to the dark cave-like opening of the tunnel. As he entered the tunnel, the moonlight vanished, and it was like leaving daylight and entering night. But he strode on confidently, having used this route many times in the past. Experience enabled him to pace his steps exactly from sleeper to sleeper, although he could not see them. His footsteps echoed along the tunnel, together with the noise of tiny splashes as drips of water fell from the roof of the tunnel into the pools of stagnant water below. As he strode along, he could hear the scratching patter of the rats, as they scurried around in the tunnel, searching for food. Here and there he could hear the rustling of paper, as their sharp little teeth gnawed away at some scraps thrown from a passing train. Every now and then he would hiss out a "Shoo! Get away!" and listen to their claws scampering on the cinders. Then he was out in the clean moonlight again, and able to see where he was going. The church clock was striking 1 o'clock as he turned down his street. He was thinking of how Veronica would feel having him home in bed with her. She would be in bed by now. He would go up quietly, undress, and then kiss her gently. She would wake up, and he would make love to her, and they would be blissfully happy. His stride quickened as his imagination created the scene for him. He did love Veronica so deeply, and he did want her so much. He quietly opened the gate and closed it behind him. Then, to his amazement, he saw the dark hulk of a motorbike in the pathway, leaning against the wall. He looked at the number plate and recognized it as the bike of one of his best friends, Stephen Holland's. But what on earth was it doing here at this time? Puzzled, he went to the back door and slipped his key into the lock. He quietly opened and closed the door and sat down on the floor to take off his shoes. All he could hear was his own heavy breathing after the brisk walk home. The house was dark and quiet, but he could find his way around with his eyes shut. He crept silently up the stairs and tiptoed along the passage to the bedroom door. Before he reached the door, his body froze. Faintly, the voices floated from the bedroom. "Kiss me again, Steve. Oh, darling, kiss me." It was Veronica's voice, and intermingled with it were the deep grunts of a man's voice. "Love you, love you." George was dazed as he crept to the doorway. The door was half open, and he could see the large mirror of his wife's dressing table. Reflected in the mirror and bathed in white moonlight lay the naked bodies of his wife and Stephen Holland's. Veronica's body looked like a white marble statue lying there, while the darker body of Stephen lay more in the shadow. But George could see quite clearly the heads locked in a passionate kiss, while Stephen's dark hand caressed the white moonlit body of his wife. The dark hand fascinated George. He watched its every move, and the more it caressed her naked flesh, the more he hated it. George knew if he watched much more, he would charge in and kill both of them there and then. But instant death would be too good for them. They must suffer for this, and suffer they would. George left the house as silently as he had entered, and made his way back to the signal box for the night. And every step of the way back, his plan became clearer and clearer. And when he finally reached the box, he was actually smiling. George returned home at his usual time, and was careful to behave exactly as he normally did. He went to bed at the usual time, and got up at 3:30 p.m. when Veronica called him. After his meal, He went to get some more of the pills that the doctor had prescribed to help him sleep, and then packed his sandwich box as usual. At 7 o'clock, he told Veronica that he had dropped in to see Stephen while he was out. He watched her face carefully as he was talking to her, but, apart from the fact that she avoided his eyes while she spoke, she covered up very well. "What did you want to see Stephen for?" she asked, pretending to be looking for something in a drawer. "Oh, just to ask him to bring you over to the signal box at 10:30 this evening," he answered casually. Veronica looked at him for the first time since Stephen's name had been mentioned. "What on earth do I want to go over to your silly little box at 10:30 for, may I ask?" she said sarcastically. "It's a big surprise, dear," he said, smiling at her. "I can't tell you yet, but I know it will make you very happy." Veronica did not answer back, but looked very puzzled. "Well, will you come, darling?" he asked. "What did Stephen say?" she asked cautiously. "Why, he said he'd come with you, with pleasure," answered George. "Oh, very well then, but I'm not staying long, mind, and you'd better not be wasting my time." "I wouldn't dream of dragging you over for nothing, dear. You know that," said George soothingly. Veronica grunted and went about her work again. That evening, when he started his shift, George did not unlock his magazine cupboard as usual, but took out 3 china tea mugs and poured some milk into each one. Then he took some tablets from a little brown bottle and dropped them in 2 of the mugs. He got the Primus stove working and put the kettle on. When Veronica and Stephen appeared at the door of the signal box, he was just pouring the boiling water into the teapot. "Ah, here you are," he said cheerfully. "Just in time for a cup of tea." Veronica and Stephen sat down without comment, while George fussed around, trying to make them feel at home. "Now, shall I be mother?" he laughed as he poured the steaming tea into the 3 mugs. "Help yourselves to sugar." He pushed forward the tin box. "Here we are. The mugs with handles for the guests, the one without for me." "Now look here, George, we didn't come all the way over here at this time of night just to play tea parties with you." Veronica's eyes flashed as she spoke. "You said you had some—" "Patience, my dear," interrupted George. "All in good time. Just relax, drink your tea, and make yourselves at home." Veronica and Stephen exchanged a quick glance, then settled back with their tea. While they were drinking, George pretended to be too busy to talk, and fussed around the signal box looking in books and pretending to check everything. At last he settled down and drank his tea. "Now," he said, "my good news is that I have been promoted to a bigger box in the north of England." He paused and watched his wife and her lover, then continued. "We get a house supplied, so as we will not be seeing Stephen any more, I thought it a good idea to have this little farewell tea party." He beamed across at them. Veronica looked stunned. She gazed at Stephen, not knowing what to say. "Well, isn't anyone going to congratulate me then?" asked George with a smile. Veronica and Stephen were too busy looking at each other in desperation to congratulate him. "Well, dear me," continued George, "anyone would think you didn't want me to get this job, dear. Are you sure you wouldn't rather stay with Stephen? I can go on my own if you like." He waited for her reply. Veronica seemed to have difficulty in thinking. She was holding her head and her eyes looked very tired. "I don't want to go to... But that was all she said, before her head slumped to one side of the armchair. "Veronica, what is it?" Stephen asked, getting to his feet and bending over her. But he seemed to lose his balance and toppled head first to the floor and lay in a heap where he had fallen. George's smile widened. "Yes, I knew you wanted to be together, my dears, so together you shall be." He went to his cupboard and took out a coil of wire and a lantern. He placed the articles on the table and then began to undress his wife. Stephen felt the sting of cold water on his face and opened his eyes. He was lying inside a railway tunnel with George Wiggs standing over him with a lantern. He felt cold and stiff and tried to get up. "Sorry, Stephen, old chap, but I'm afraid you can't get up. You see, I've tied you down with wire." Stephen screwed his head around and saw that his wrists and ankles were securely tied with wire in such a way that his arms and legs were spread-eagled across the railway lines. "Yes, Stephen," said George, realizing Stephen had seen his plight. "When the train comes along, it will sever both feet just above the ankles, and both hands and arms nearly to the elbows." "You madman!" cried Stephen. "You can't do this. Let me go at once. Get this wire off. Do you hear me?" "Yes, I hear you, Stephen, but I'm just making sure your dirty little hands don't touch my wife any more." George grinned down at him. "Clever, don't you think, Stephen? And if you concentrate, you should be able to feel Veronica's feet with your feet. You see, she's in exactly the same dilemma as you are." Stephen craned his head and gazed down over his own naked body towards his feet, and there he saw the naked, spread-eagled body of Veronica. So that was the plan. The train would pass over both of them and just cut off their arms and feet, so that they died slowly in great pain. He dropped his head back, exhausted. "Please listen, George. I'll do anything you say, just—" "Sorry, old chap," said George, "but you're wasting your time. I've got to go now anyway, so I'll just wake Veronica, and then I'll leave you two lovebirds to it." With that, he splashed some water over Veronica, waited until she opened her eyes, then said, "Goodbye, Veronica. I hope you and your lover will be very happy for the next 10 minutes. Then he picked up his lantern and crunched his way back along the cinders towards the signal box. In the feeble glow of moonlight that reached them from the mouth of the tunnel, Veronica twisted her head to try and understand what was happening. She babbled a stream of questions to Stephen, and when she got the answers, she just screamed at the top of her voice to George to come and set her free. But George did not come. He was too busy making a bonfire with 2 piles of clothes behind the signal box. Even while she was screaming at the top of her voice, Stephen could hear the distant rumble of the approaching train. He tugged with his arms and legs, but the wire merely bit deeper into the flesh. He looked along the tunnel in time to see the front lights of the train flashing down towards them. The tracks were trembling beneath his legs and arms now, and Veronica's screams filled his ears with the roar of the engine. He pressed his head back, closed his eyes, and felt his body stiffen in anticipation. 2 red-hot knives seemed to slice through his legs, then his arms, while all around thunder seemed to be crashing at him. Then the thunder rolled away into the distance. He was aware of a burning pain in his arms and legs. He opened his eyes weakly and looked at the horrible little stumps that twitched just below each elbow. He clumsily propped himself up on his left elbow and saw his legs now came to dark points, while on either side of the rails an array of feet and forearms with open hands lay strewn about. Veronica groaned, then, remembering what had just happened, began screaming again as she saw the severed parts of her body. Stephen knew that they were both bleeding badly now, but would probably suffer this horrible pain for a long time before death finally came. Veronica was beside herself now, calling George every name she could think of, in between her wild screaming fits. Stephen realized that there was only one way out for them. In extreme pain, he worked his body on his bleeding stumps over to her. Then, wrapping the remains of his arms around her neck, he dragged her head round and placed it over the sticky rail. Then he placed his head over and tried to hold her still as best he could. He hoped that the wait for the next train would not be too long, and when it came it would sever off the heads cleanly so that they would die quickly. While they waited, lying in the warm pool of their mingling bloods, their attention was distracted by the long dark shapes that scurried around them, slowly getting nearer. Suddenly Veronica shrieked as a long fat rat began gnawing at her right foot, which was about a yard from her face. Other rats then closed in to start nibbling at the other parts of severed limbs that lay around. Stephen tried to grip her to comfort her, but by now she was raving away to herself. Suddenly she began complaining of the pain in her ankles getting worse. Stephen could think of nothing to say in comfort to her when he looked over his shoulder down at her legs, and to his horror saw two black shapes pulling and chewing at the stumps of her legs. He threw his right leg across hers, and the shapes scuttled back into the shadows. Then, under his throat, he felt the rail vibrate, and he knew the end would soon come. He made sure her neck was also on the trembling rail, then closed his eyes. He felt her body stiffen against his as the roar of the train approached. He felt her firm breasts press against his body. Then a great white light flashed through his head. Then darkness.